Welcome, everyone. Hello. I am here from Bridge Raise. My name is Heather Nelson. Please join in and tell me where you're from in the chat so I know that we're live and it's all working. I am so pleased today to be here to talk about the visible framework and the integrated fundraising approach. I know that all of you know I love seeing collaboration in all the things. And so this kind of topic really speaks to me. I'm Heather Nelson. I'm a corporate partnership specialist. I work at and lead the organization of Bridge Raise. If you want to know more about us, you can check us out on web or through LinkedIn. I post regularly here and love having conversations with all of you. Our conversation today is with Cathy Mann, and Cathy Mann is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. We collaborate. We love working together, and I am so thrilled to have her share her perspective on integrated fundraising with you. Over to you, Cathy, to tell people a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, thanks, Heather. I am president and founder of the Fundraising Lab. We've been doing this work as a consulting team for about 18 years. I've been in this sector for more years than I want to admit. And I would say that, my sweet spot is working with social justice organizations, kind of raising between $500,000 and 10 million, although usually they're somewhere between 500,000 and 5 million. I've been doing this for over 30 years and still continue to get excited about seeing organizations raise money so they can support their important missions. So I'm pretty jazzed every day to come to work.
I love that. Yeah. And your enthusiasm always comes through in your work, which is one of the things I love about you, Cathy, that you can tell when you're, so committed to the organizations that you're working with. And the causes that they support. And I know that this topic is one that you feel very passionate about because we know it is such a game changer when we want to see success at these organizations and that it makes the biggest difference. So let's get started by talking about just defining what you mean when you say and has an integrated approach to fundraising as opposed to something like that would be more discreet.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of organizations, and I'm going to apologize in advance, I have COVID, so I've still got a little bit of a residual cough. So every now and again, I might have to put my mouth in my elbow or whatever, prick my arm. So lots of organizations will do the things, right? They have a direct marketing program. They do foundation grant writing. Maybe they run an event, but they kind of lurch from initiative to initiative without really taking a step back and looking at it and saying, how can these things all connect to each other? Rather than how do we, what often happens is we get the direct mail done and then we rush off because now we know the event is coming up and we know that's going to take a lot of time and effort. And then maybe in the background, there's some foundation grants that are getting written, but they're kind of being done without paying attention to the bigger context. So that's what most of us tend to do. We each do our things. And sometimes with my clients, it's one person doing all of those things. What I really like to see is how do each of the discrete fundraising strategies that we have in place, how can they support and cross-pollinate with the other strategies that are going on? I know you have other questions. We've talked about other questions, so I don't want to get ahead of myself.
No, and that's perfect. And it's for me as the specialist in the corporate area, it's so great to hear because honestly, so often I see exactly what you're saying, that the corporate is off by itself. Sometimes one version of corporate is actually off by itself, and there's another version of corporate that's like inside the event. So it's like we're treating even company fundraising in two separate and discrete ways. And sometimes even in a third place in foundations, and there'll be like a few corporate sort of stuck in there somehow. And so, I'm the same, like if you take a step back and think about, okay, how are we working with companies, and and you can pull the thread from all these different places, and in bigger shops sometimes it's even in major gifts. So how can that not be so discreet, and then also on the other side, this sort of the messaging piece, like there's to me so many opportunities for messaging and tools to be leveraged across the platform, across the groups. I don't work as often with one person that's doing all of the things, but I do think some of the same strategies apply, whether it's one person or a number of departments. So when we think about, I know that this is not just a question of like saying, hey, yes, we should do it. It is going to require something deeper than that. So if an organization sort of starts thinking to themselves, yeah, this is how we want to be working. We want to have a more integrated system. What are some, changes that you feel need to happen at the organization level so that, this can happen, this can be facilitated, it can be effective?
So the first place I'll start is planning. And it's really interesting to me that it doesn't seem to matter whether I'm working with organizations that have a one-person development department or a 10-person development department. Planning is the thing that really gets short shrift. And so if you don't take the time to step back and plan, then you don't have the opportunity to take a look at how different strategies can cross-pollinate with each other. So
Right.
I'm a big proponent of planning.
Right.
Whether you're a one-person shop or a 10-person shop or a, dozens of people in a fundraising department. I think that planning is equally important, whether you're a small shop or a bigger shop. Probably gets more important the more people you have, because the more moving parts there are, you want to make sure that you're intentionally thinking through how those moving parts connect with each other. And if you're a one-person shop, you can kind of just you can keep it in your head. I don't love that. I still think you need to take it out and put it on paper. But so planning is just the place where you need to start. I think there's some really bigger and deeper things that we need to be thinking about. And so I'm going to get heavy for a minute.
Do it. Go.
Like a lot of the fundraising that we practice is built on these hierarchical models. And if you look at the history of fundraising, some of the initial campaigns in the last century, like I'm not talking about philanthropy over the millennia, but in the last 100 or so years, a lot of it comes from military strategy. So some of our ways of thinking about fundraising are hierarchical. So I think we need to think about how to democratize fundraising. And rather than thinking about these metrics that are really distinct from each other and hierarchical, how do they become collective instead of individual? And so, we see metrics where once somebody gives $50,000, that person in our lexicon becomes a major gift donor, and they go into a different team. What kind of consideration has been given to the fact that the donor, when they were giving smaller amounts of money, had a relationship built by a different team, maybe the annual giving team? So I think that some of these metrics and just ways of thinking about and measuring our work really needs to be looked at. And I think we need to Sesame Street it, collaborate, share. So it's about, I guess that's kind of democratizing our ways of thinking about fundraising. And we see this all the time, right? Where you get territoriality because someone wants to own that donor because they want to get credit for that gift. And so I think that whole structure is perhaps doing us more harm than good.
I could not agree more. One of the exercises we do with clients really early on is come up with like a guiding principle for their corporate partnerships. And it's meant to not talk about like specific numbers, but more like, what are the types of companies we want to work with? And what do we want these relationships to look like? And that kind of thing. And it's that same idea of, instead of starting from a place of we need this many dollars and we're going to go after anybody, let's talk about what kind of companies and relationships we want to have. And then, and then start building from there. And it does really change the focus. And I think that similarly, if the different departments had a collective objective, as opposed to like departmental objectives, this would be the kind of conversation that you could start saying, like, how can we all win together? How can we all advance this mission together, as opposed to by department? It would make a really big difference. I also have a whole, like, I get on the soapbox about individual objectives all the time, because I often feel like when we set up individual objectives for people, they can sometimes be at cross purposes with the collective objective. And then we put people in a very difficult spot where they are trying to like personally like feed their families with by getting, their financial targets. And that may be, to the detriment of the fundraising program. So I could not agree more. I think it's very important to plan. And part of that planning to me is, this more collective conversation. If you're a one-person shop, there still could be a collective conversation, because you could have board pressures and leadership and who knows who else has got to say.
And even in a one-person shop, you don't do fundraising on your own.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. So let's talk about real life.
A couple more things though. About that. So there's reimagining metrics. There's like moving from the kind of hierarchical to collective. But I think there's also just a really practical one that we see all the time with our clients is like share data, because are your bequest donors in an Excel sheet and not in the database? We see this all the time, right? When we're helping clients move to a new system, one of the things we will do is just an inventory of where is all the data. And it's in systems,
email boxes,
and Excel, and emails, and heads. And so making sure that you've got some sort of shared data structure, I think, is really important. And then the last thing is just around like cross-functional skill development. So, the bigger shops, the bigger the shop that you're in, the more that you're placed in a particular skill set, right? You do annual giving or major gifts or events or whatever. I think it's really important for individuals in those kinds of positions to have opportunities to see what it's like to do the other stuff in your shop, so that you have an understanding, you have a perspective on what it means to be working in those other disciplines.
That's very helpful to think about that. And I do think, like, practically speaking, that may be one of the reasons that sometimes the siloing happens, is because, the task or the project requirements, but there's a person in a different department that better suits and obviously we see this in corporate all the time. There is a certain skill set around negotiating with companies, and therefore sometimes then it makes sense for something to move from one place to another. But if it's, to your point, like if there's a way of making sure that everyone understands and has enough training to kind of appreciate the work of each other, that can really be helpful. I do remember also bringing, like, I think this is when you sometimes bring people from programming or marketing to a meeting. And even if, just so they can see what the conversation is like. I remember doing that and bringing one of my research team to a really senior meeting with a company. And we got there and we started talking, and I had my researcher and he was talking. And then the woman said, "Stop, I'm bringing my government person too." And she called someone else in, and the conversation really changed. But at the end, as we were walking home, he's like, "I had no idea that that's what your conversations were like." and it was like just such an eye opener. And I think that if we can, let people into what we're doing, it makes it much easier for this integration to happen for sure.
Yeah, agreed.
So you have had some success with, moving people from fragmented to a more integrated approach. Can you tell me, give an example so that it really lands with people around, what it looks like, what this shift could be?
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes I've had success, and sometimes it's been really challenging
Right.
because sometimes that fragmentation is because there are structural things that we've discussed where
Mhm.
you're incentivized to raise your money and
Mhm.
you don't feel particularly open to sharing if that means you're not going to get credit for that gift. Um, and sometimes, I mean, not everybody grew up watching Sesame Street, I guess. Not everybody wants to share.
Mhm.
But I think that um, when there has been success, it's because there's been leadership that has supported the shift to a more collaborative approach. So
Mhm.
you can't continue to have the same structure that creates that lack of incentive to collaborate and then
Yeah.
expect there to be collaboration.
Right.
So there needs to be a system-wide change for this notion of integrated fundraising to take root, and there has to be patience for the for that change to happen, right? So it's all about principles of change management, understanding what motivates people to change, and how do you ensure some of those are in place, so that people will feel like they can change without any risk.
Right. Right. And just planning for it is not like planning gets them started, but then there's like some real tangible effort and time and patience and
And
things that have to happen. Yeah.
and people not honoring what they said they were going to do because they don't trust that it's going to
Mhm.
happen.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of trust
Right.
in this notion of integrated fundraising, and so the leadership has to be on side. And I don't just mean fundraising leadership, but the entire
Okay. Yes.
organization,
Yeah.
because fundraising doesn't operate in a bubble,
No.
and the culture of the organization does impact the culture of the fundraising shop. So it has to be an organization wide
Yeah.
initiative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we said the power of integrated fundraising, and I know that's our focus, but to me, if you the integrated an organization that can do integrated fundraising is also integrating fundraising with marketing and programming and like that it's a whole thing, right? Like
Yeah,
you're integrating fundraising into your organization, and also the silos of fundraising are also breaking down.
yeah. I mean, I was just talking with a client today about we're doing some direct marketing work with them, and um, there's these beautiful stories about some clients, um, and there's going to be a digital component to it. But initially, it was like direct mail, and I was like, well,
Right.
but we've got these amazing stories now. How do we share these stories, not
Yeah.
just to donors, but across any of the marketing comms that you're doing? What are the other opportunities that we have to share these amazing stories? Because this is your mission. This is a demonstration of how powerful your mission is. Um, so yeah, it's across the organization. And we only have those good stories. This is where I was going, because the program people said, oh, you should speak with so and so.
Right.
And so that's an organization that is moving towards this notion of integrated fundraising. So it's not just the fundraising team,
Yeah.
there's the marketing comms, there's the program people who are beginning to understand their role in fundraising also.
Yeah, and I'm just going to reiterate again what you already said about trust. If a program team is going to introduce fundraisers into story gathering, that is one of the highest degrees of trust in my experience that is required and I think that, that's you're just so important that as an organization, you're building that trust in order for that to be the case. Otherwise, fundraising teams never get the stories because there's fear of how they're going to be used and things like that. We see that with corporate all the time too, not wanting a corporate funder because they are afraid that the corporate funder may influence the mission or things like that. Again, if you trust your fundraising team to negotiate with the company appropriately and not include companies that don't meet, the values and the criteria that have been set out, then there's trust, and then companies can come on board and they can be a big boost to an organization. But if trust is lacking, then there's a fear that that won't be the case. And so yeah, you mentioning trust, I could not agree more that that's a key feature. And then it's what are the mechanisms you're putting in place to foster that. So practically speaking, what are some like strategies and tools that you recommend to bring this alignment across the departments?
Well, I think one of the things is so intangible that it's almost hard to talk about. But like the invisible framework, when I think about it, our framework with working with clients is strategies and infrastructure, and then culture and values. And those are the 4 quadrants. And most of us operate on strategies and infrastructure.
Okay.
And we fundraisers talk a good game about culture of philanthropy. We don't actually necessarily do a good game of helping organizations figure out how to develop that culture. We almost never talk about values. And in a world that I inhabit, where I'm working with a lot of social justice organizations who maybe don't always feel quite as comfortable with fundraising, if I don't start a conversation about fundraising and values, they're just going to continue to think that fundraising is icky and gross, and that I'm I don't know, no offense to used car salesman, but that I'm just trying to sell something that doesn't have an engine under the hood. And so I think in answer to your question, part of what you need to do is make sure that there is values alignment, and that non-fundraising staff and fundraising staff alike understand that the fundraising program rest on the values of the organization. I think that's actually an early conversation that that we as fundraisers should be having with our organizations, because it gets to the heart of the matter oftentimes. Like I get a lot of resistance. I remember an early job that I had was an well, I won't say the name of the organization, but it was a super left-leaning organization. And they just thought I was the man. Like they didn't trust me. They thought I was just going to sell their soul. And it was over time that they began to see that, I was in fact had the best interests of the organization at heart. And I was in fact sharing messages that were true to the organization, that I wasn't going off trying to raise money for pediatric oncology when we had nothing to do with pediatric oncology. Because for some organizations, there's a fear that the fundraiser is just going to raise money for things that are outside of what you do, but it's money, so they're going to say yes to it. So anyway, I think that whole notion of making sure that you're clear about the values is a starting point. Now I've gotten myself away from what your initial question was.
No, I totally agree with that. And that's one of the reasons we do this values exercise also right at the beginning, because I also feel like sometimes, like, even though they've hired us to help, there's still that trepidation about corporate. And then also, I always encourage, this is a very practical thing, that often even organizations that say that they're all aligned, they have verbalized that perhaps in a workshop or something on a specific service day, and we push them to write them down in guidelines, because I feel like the sustainability of that, the people who weren't in the room, over time it gets fuzzy on the edges. And so we really push organizations to write those down. We help organizations write those things down, because I do think it's very important. And if your fundraising department has value statements and guidelines, and it ramps up to the organizational values and strategy, then you're in a much more solid place to see this integration and to develop the trust. So I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's a beautiful place to start, and really can then inform the strategy, as you said, and the planning, which we both want everybody to do.
Right.
But yeah, I think, you know, that bigger conversation is really important, because there is also, I think, different approaches that you can take to fundraising, and that once the values conversations happen, then that helps make those decisions, like which,
Yeah.
you know, what approaches are going to be appropriate for that organization.
Yeah.
Do you see, and we sort of touched on this a little bit, but let's just, I would like to follow it again, like the difference between this happening in a smaller shop and a bigger shop. And one of the things I'm wondering about is, particularly with a smaller shop, when you're dealing then with volunteers and boards and things like that. I know that you often work with organizations that have a lot of different, you know, people involved and groups involved in the organizations, because they're maybe a bit smaller. Like, how is it different? How do you see this show up differently, or what do you suggest in structuring it differently?
Well, I think that I think the values conversation is maybe even more important in a smaller shop, because in a bigger shop, there's history, there's there's culture that exists because of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a smaller shop, if somebody, especially if somebody is new is introducing fundraising to the
Mm-hmm.
organization, that values conversation needs to happen right away. Um, because there are so many misconceptions about fundraising. People understand fundraising to be what they understand it to be. So part of that values conversation helps unearth some of that. So no,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to do, I don't know, you name it. People, I hate telemarketing. Like, well,
Yeah.
okay, well, we're too little. We're not going to do telemarketing. Or to the degree
Yeah.
that we're going to do telemarketing, we're actually going to engage our volunteers, because they have such a deep understanding of the organization. Does that feel like it would be, more in keeping with the values of this organization if it was folks you knew? Oh, well, wait a minute. So, you begin able to have different conversations.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me what non-fundraisers think fundraising is.
Right.
And so
Yes.
there's this Indian parable of three blind men and an elephant. Are
Okay.
you familiar with this? So,
No,
uh,
bring us up to speed.
okay. So one guy is placed by the leg, and he describes an elephant as being like a tree trunk, huge and round and thick. Another guy is placed by the tusk, and he describes an elephant as being like a spear. And another guy is by the tail, and he describes an elephant as being like a snake. They're all right, but they're
Mm-hmm.
only seeing a piece of the puzzle. And fundraising is a very big elephant that has many different disciplines
Mm-hmm.
within it. And non-fundraisers only know the piece that they know, right? So I often go into boards with like very senior executives, and they're like, I know fundraising because they did their alumni campaign, or because they are involved in the United Way campaign at work.
Right.
So they have pieces of a
Mm-hmm.
puzzle, but they don't have the full puzzle. And I think that's a really important component to share throughout your organization, especially if you're in a smaller organization, so that the non-fundraisers in the organization understand what fundraising means in your context. And we come back full circle to why a plan is important, so that you can show people the plan and say, this is how we are going to fundraise for this mission in this organization.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me when you talk about it that way. Like, first, making sure that everyone is understanding what we're talking about before the like plan gets built, and then certainly before the plan gets presented to those individuals who may also have invested interest in one component or a couple of the components, so that they can see the whole, yeah, as you said, the whole elephant. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
We're getting near the end, and I always like to be as practical as possible, because we do have often some smaller organizations listening. So without allowing them to get totally overwhelmed, what would be the one thing you'd say, here's where you should start if you feel like you're in a fragmented situation and you want to start on the pathway to be more integrated?
Plan. So create a plan. I will plug my online course, Planning with Purpose, which you can find at fundraisinglab.ca. Go into the courses tab. The planning is really going to help you prevent lurching from direct mail to event to foundation grant, which is what I see a lot of small shops doing because they just don't have time. And I actually say this to people all the time, plan. And I can't tell you how many times people say, I don't have time to plan. And I'm like, yep,
Right.
I get it. Need to figure out how to carve that time out because it's going to save you loads of time down the road.
100% agree. I also think a plan is important. And from a corporate lens, this integrated concept is so important because it's very, very difficult from my point of view to be successful in corporate fundraising if corporate is isolated or fragmented across all the different buckets. I see both all the time. Planning allows us to, as you said, get it into a database, figure out who's who, who's where. This happens equally often in big organizations as small organizations. Like, we've divided it up in a way that makes zero sense to the company. Getting in, like, talking about it from a planning point of view allows you to have that conversation. Like, who are these individuals, companies that we want to raise money from? Forget how we want to divide it up. What makes sense to them in their relationship journey with the organization? And, and having that conversation, both from a planning perspective and a relationship perspective, to me is like a really great exercise.
Well, and I always think that corporate fundraising is like the quintessential example of why you want an integrated fundraising program, because a great relationship with a corporation, might result in cash, might result in sponsorships to events, might result in seconded workers, might result in really meaningful employee engagement, might result in, like, you name it.
Like CEO giving a major gift, the list is like, that's it. Their employees becoming individual donors. I mean, if it's done well, we have like all the places that this can show up. And it's one of the easier places to see the fragmentation, honestly. And so I see it too. And I think, you're planning, and I love the idea. We're sort of out of time here, but the idea of thinking of that from a purpose lens or a values lens, where we both very closely align, that values has to drive fundraising if you're going to have fundraising that the whole organization feels good about, right? Exactly. And where you're not selling a car that has no engine, which I love that analogy too. Thank you so much for joining me today, Cathy. I hope everybody got an idea, a tactic, a bit of inspiration from our conversation. As you mentioned, go look at Cathy's Planning with Purpose course as one option to get you started on a planning approach, or reach out to either of us with questions. We'd be happy to answer. We will go into the chat after and make sure we've answered any questions that you have. Thank you so much. Is there anything else about where to find you, or that you'd like to share with everybody as we just wrap up here, Cathy?
Website's fundraisinglab.ca. I'm more or less active on LinkedIn. Some weeks I'm more active, some weeks I'm less active, but certainly check me out on LinkedIn too.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm Heather Nelson. You can find me at bridgeraise.com, here on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.